starting with our angles. So this is about proving the triangle's congruent. And if we want to prove triangles congruent, then we want to talk about our sides and angles that we can prove congruent. I'm going to go ahead and put a star by the ones that we use the most often, but I'll talk about all of them. Vertical angles, we use this one all the time. This is one of our two things that we can get from the diagram, is that vertical angles are congruent. Right angles are congruent. That's all to say about that. Perpendicular lines, that's an important one. If we know perpendicular lines, then perpendicular lines are going to create what kind of angles? It's going to be right angles, 90 degrees, 90 degrees. So if I know lines are perpendicular, that's going to tell me that those angles are right angles, 90 degrees. So that will tell me that those angles are congruent. So that is my perpendicular lines. Then we go on to, these are the new ones. So you wrote down a list like this before. These are the ones that weren't on that list. We have corresponding, alternate interior, alternate exterior. These are if I am given, which you'll see a lot today, I am given that those are parallel, then I have all these different types of angles. Alternate interior is the one you're going to see the most often. Because when I know the lines are parallel, those kind of angles are going to be congruent. Reflexive property, we usually see it for sides, not for angles, but there it is. And then we have angle bisector. Angle bisector, remember, splits an angle into two equal pieces. Equal pieces, well, that's great news for us. Means they're congruent. Okay, so that's my list for angles. Our list for sides is a lot shorter, but we use them quite a bit. We use all of them quite a bit. We have midpoint. Hopefully you know what a midpoint is by now. It splits the side into two equal pieces. Then we have the segment bisector. Does the same thing, splits it in half. And then reflexive property. Here's where we see it for the sides. Again, this is one of our two things we can get from the diagram, is where there's a side shared in both triangles. Then we have our methods for the triangles congruent. So see if you can write down what those 5 methods are before I do. See if you remember what those are. But again, before we can get the triangles congruent, we either have pairs of sides or pairs of angles. And we're going to use the information we are given to get those pairs of sides or pairs of angles. So for example, when we were given a midpoint, we used that to say, hey, this pair of sides is congruent. And that told us a pair of sides. Or if we're given perpendicular lines, we're going to use that to say, hey, these angles are congruent because they're both going to be right angles. Or, here's the new part, if we're told they're parallel, well then these alternate interior angles or corresponding angles are going to be congruent. Let's see if we got those methods down. It's side, 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 angle, 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 side, hypotenuse, leg. You just need to write down the abbreviations. Remember, hypotenuse leg is only for right triangles. Again, nothing new here. I have not shown you anything that you haven't seen before. Remember the difference between angle, and angle, side is whether the side is included between two angles. That's a visual in the diagram. Is the side included between those two angles? Then, before we get to those next set of bullet points, so we're not at that next set of bullet points yet, we are at CPCTC. Right above those bullet points, you're going to write down what CPCTC stands for. Corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. And remember that that says once we know, after we know the triangles are congruent by side, 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 or side, angle, side, after that, we use that to say these matching sides or these matching angles had to be the same. All three pairs of sides and all three pairs of angles have to match as soon as we know that the triangles are congruent. Finally, on this page, we have the converses. The converses are going to be very similar to what we already looked at, which is looking at corresponding alternate interior, alternate exterior, all of those. Remember that the difference between the statement and the converse is that it's switched around. It switches that hypothesis and conclusion. So the original statement says, I know we have parallel lines, therefore corresponding angles are congruent. So you knew they were parallel, we came up with the angles. The converse will switch that. The converse is when you know about the angles and want to say that they're parallel. So that's what those converses will do for me. These we use less often. But again, instead of I know they're parallel, here's what's true about the angles. It's I know these angles, therefore these are parallel. Okay? So that is the end of our list on the first page. On that second page, if you're done writing down the list on the first page, then flip to the next page and you've got the distance formula, midpoint formula, slope formula, and see if you can get those written down. See if you remember what those are before I put them up on the board. And again, a big reason we're kind of ending the semester with this is that it ties together a lot of stuff from chapter 3 with a lot of stuff from chapter 4. So it's a lot of ideas that tie together. So it's a nice little wrap up in the semester. So next, I'm going to go through 2 proofs. We'll do 2 of them together today, and then I'll ask you to do one on your own. So as a reminder for how we did these, you started with your given information and looked at how to use it. If it didn't say this pair of sides is congruent, this pair of angles is congruent, then we used the information to tell us a pair of sides or a pair of angles. Then when we were out a given, we went to the diagram. We looked for either vertical angles or reflexive property. And then after that diagram, we then said which method for the triangles. Side, 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 angle, side, based on the information that we had gotten before. So that's the steps that these follow. Let's take a look. So first example. This is your first example on the next page here. All right. Here is our first piece of given information. Our reason is that it's given. Anytime you're copy pasting right from the given, your reason is given. Done. However, does this symbol mean congruent? No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. What does it mean? It means that they are parallel. Very good. So we have W to U and we have y to v. We are told that they are parallel. It's even got the little arrows in the diagram that's marking them parallel. So if you want to call anything new that we're looking at, this is the new part. So pay attention here. Watch this closely. We know that these are parallel. What that's going to tell us is a pair of angles. Is a pair of angles, and we're going to make a transversal. Cuts through those parallel lines. And we take a look at those two angles, and we know that those are congruent. Our job is to pick out what kind of angles we're looking at there. Well, some of you might recognize the shape of that, but we also see this is bottom left with bottom left. If we draw those out separately, bottom left with bottom left, they're in the same place. That means that these are corresponding angles. So we're going to say, hey, these angles are congruent. How do I know that? Because they're corresponding angles. And I know when lines are parallel, that will tell me the corresponding angles are congruent. So there is pair of angles number one. One piece of information down, two to go. We've got piece of information number two. Does that mean they're congruent? Still no. That still means that they're parallel. So we're going to still go and mark these parallel. Right there. And then we're going to take this same transversal, slicing through those parallel lines. And guess what? We have bottom right with bottom right. So those are still what kind of angles? It's still corresponding. And those corresponding angles are going to be congruent. So I'm going to outline those. That is UXW right here with VZY as right here. And why do I know those are congruent? Because they're corresponding angles. And I know corresponding angles have to be congruent. Does this mean that they're congruent? Yes. Oh, finally. We can just write that it's given. It's a pair of sides. All good. All done. And it's got the tick mark right there in the diagram as well. So now we have all of our pieces of information. So now we can say the triangles are congruent because we proved three different pieces of information. So we showed how many pairs of sides? Just one. How many pairs of angles? Two. All right, and then we look up at our diagram. Is the side that we have included in between those two angles? Yes, it is. Right? It is right there. This one in between those two angles. So, therefore, our method, angle, side, angle. Side included between those two angles. And that's the end of our proof. We're going to do another one together. I'm going to jump to number 3. We'll do number 2 next time. But I want to jump to number 3. Which is right here. So again, we're going to start with the given information. If it doesn't just say things are congruent, then we need to go on to figure out what sides or what angles are congruent. So we start with the easy part, which is Here it is, it's given, copy pasted right from the given. That is piece of information number 1 from right here. A to B, C to D. We're given that they're parallel, so what are we going to put in this diagram to mark them parallel? We put these little arrows that mark, that's how we mark things parallel. All right. Then we are going to draw a transversal that cuts through both of those lines. That transversal is going to start at A and go to C. Cuts through those parallel lines. And that's naturally going to create, tracing out this angle and this angle. Inside or outside these parallel lines? Inside, and then same side or different side of this transversal? Different, because this one and this one, one's below, one's above. So inside the parallel lines, different sides of the transversal makes it alternate interior angles. So those angles are congruent because they are alternate interior angles. Let me trace those out again to show how we write out the statement. Show how we write out the statement. We start at B. We go into A, come out through C. That is the first angle. And then the other angle starts at D, goes into C, and comes out through A. B, A, C, D, C, A. And how do we know those are congruent? Because they're alternate interior angles, and alternate interior angles have to be congruent. So now we move on to piece of given information number 2. We aren't told they're congruent, but we can figure out something being congruent. So before I show it, see if you can write out what step 4 is going to say. Both what the statement is, where those angles are, and the reason, what kind of angles are they? A to D, we have B to C. There's that transversal cutting through. So again, for our statement, we're going to write down what angles that tells us are congruent. And for our reason, we're going to write what kind of angles they are. I'm going to start us with this angle right here, which is D into A and out through C. And then the other angle is going to be A in through C and out through B. And those are alternate interior angles. So our reason, they're alternate interior angles, and alternate interior angles are congruent. Now we're out of given information. So now we look to the diagram, and our choices for the diagram are reflexive property or vertical angles. And so we look at our diagram. Which one do we see? It's reflexive property. And reflexive property is from A to where? C. Yes. This side is common in both triangles. So we're going to say that's going to be congruent to itself, reflexive property. Therefore, the triangles are congruent. Side included between those two angles. So once again, we're using angle, side, angle. questions so far? All right. Here's the one I'm going to ask you to do on your own, but I'm going to start it with you and then ask you to do the rest. It's this one right here. All right. And the part I'm going to start with you is this given information right here. This is trickier. This is tricky. This is trickier than what I would actually put on a test or on a final. So I'm going to go through this part with you together. We have A to G. We have F to E. Well, let's start with the easy part, which is that we're just going to write down that A to G, congruent to F to E. And for my reason, where did I copy paste that from? That's the given. So I'm going to write given as my reason. All right, now that is not a pair of sides. That is not a pair of sides. Because it's not the entire way across. It's not the entire side. So I need to get to the entire side. So if I look at A to G, and I want this entire side of this triangle, what piece am I missing? I'm missing from G out to F. That's the part that's missing for this entire side. Then over on the other one, here's my piece here. What part am I missing? Well, it's the same one. It's G to F again. So regardless of where I'm talking about, G to F and G to F have to be the same. Well, I know what that reason is. I know the reason that the same thing has to be equal to itself. That is what property? It's the reflexive property. So I've got this pair of sides being the same, those two pieces being the same, and then I have that missing piece that is the same as itself. So therefore, the entire things are the same. A to F congruent to G to E. Okay? A to F congruent to G to E. And so for my reason, now I have a pair of sides. For my reason, well, what did I do? I took the pieces and put them together to make the whole thing. And that's something we did at the very beginning of the year. Our fancy name for it was segment addition postulate, which says that if I take two pieces of a segment, add it together, it makes the whole thing. So because those pieces were the same, the whole thing is going to be the same. Now, this is where I'm going to ask you to try it yourself. I will help you here by telling you that there should be 7 steps in total. So you have 4 more steps to do. I'll also tell you that 2 of the things you have left is to write out these givens. There's 2 steps right there. And then your last step is going to be to say that the triangles are congruent by whichever method you end up having. And so really that one missing step is going to be for one of these given informations, you're going to need to use it to get a pair of sides or pair of angles. So that'll be up to you to figure out how we're going to do that. That's your missing piece.